Okay, hopefully you can all hear me. I don't, I'm still learning how to get the recorded files processed out of the previous section of this class that ends 15 or 20 minutes before this class begins. And I was unsure as to whether I could open another Zoom session, so I was trying to do it on a tablet, and that just wasn't going to work at all. And so it looks like everything's working okay, so we'll see. Okay, let's kind of talk about what we're, well, first, let me fess up that I have not read your brainstorm ideas yet. I just haven't gotten to those. And I'll be on the road tomorrow for meetings in Boone and department meeting and personnel committee meeting and the university provost opening meeting and whatever else meeting I have to be in tomorrow. So I will not get that done until the weekend. And so by the first of the week, I'll have your feedback and some thoughts about where you need to go for the next slice of this project, which is due in about 3 weeks, and is kind of an improved version of this problem statement idea based on the feedback. And if you've got 2 or 3 and you have to make a choice, I'll kind of force choice you to make one of those choices between now and then. And some basic lit review stuff, some ideas of what's in the literature that kind of gives you some information about, that particular topic. And so we're going to do 2 things tonight. One, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of quantitative and qualitative research and the differences between them and, the limitations of each without getting overly specific. And then we'll spend some time at the end talking about lit reviews and talking about how to kind of deconstruct research articles and scholarly articles and conference proceedings, things like that, in a way that makes sense and makes them useful and readable to you. I often quote this because it's from a couple of research studies that were done a few years back. And I suspect it hadn't gotten any better, but they looked at, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 research articles from journals and conference proceedings and things like that over a period of 4 or 5 years, and discovered substantial methodological and logical errors in about 40% of them. And so a good number of the things that you might read from the literature will have some flaws in them. And sometimes those flaws are, kind of minor, and then maybe they don't make a hill of beans worth of difference in the outcomes, but sometimes they are substantial and they blow a hole in the whole logic of the thing. And so knowing how to look at articles and knowing how to proceed with articles gives you a little bit of a heads up on that, to be a bit more critical consumer, and maybe to use a word that I like to use a lot, a little bit more of a cynical consumer, because you have to be critical and cynical to look at things knowing that there's probably some flaws in some of it, and you want to not waste your time on things that are not going to be meaningful or useful to you. So anyhow, that's kind of at the end. We'll get to that, before we leave this evening. Any thoughts or comments or questions before we get going? Okay. Let me pull up, let me make sure I've got it queued up over here. Okay. Let me pull up what I generally have referred to as scientific methodology. It could just as easily be titled the empirical process. And so it's it has other titles we can put on it, but it is useful to use to talk about the nature of differences between quantitative and qualitative, and how, although they are different, they share some of the same notions about empirical thought. And the empirical process really involves four key elements. I say, maybe key elements is not the right word, but it's kind of the one that's coming to mind right now. And that is theory, prediction, experiment, and observation. And theory simply means that you have some idea, no matter how, over how developed or undeveloped or concrete it is, as to a connection or a relationship between at least a couple of variables. As our cognitive process is built on thinking about cause and effect. And so, if we're driving down the street and we see an accident after we are finished being concerned about anybody not being hurt or anything like that, almost immediately we begin to construct the narrative of what happened. And we have to know who did what, and I mean, we have to understand what it is that we are seeing. And so we have this cognitive drive within ourselves to always look at cause and effect. And you can think of the theory as being kind of mini cause and effect. I mean, I'm always a little bit leery of using terms like cause or causation or causality, because those are things that we never really can pin down 100%. But if you think about, is there a relationship between these two variables? Is there a relationship, if I do this, will this happen? Whether that's causation or whether that's prediction or whatever, does this make this happen? Or does this have an impact on that? Or I wonder what makes this happen. And so the theory can come in lots of different ways. It can be a more explicit theory, which is really kind of phrased in the language of cause and effect. Or it can be a little bit more ambiguous theory, which might be a guiding question. What are the factors that have to do with student success in the third grade in math? And so implied within that is that there might be some cause and effect, but we don't know enough about it to know, what the factors might be. And so we have a guiding question, something like, what are the factors? Well, a theory always lends itself to a prediction. If the theory is true, then we could predict in different circumstances, what might happen. Now, if it's an explicit theory with, a hypothesis statement with cause and effect, we know, we can say, okay, if I do this thing, will this thing happen? If I do this, will this happen? And I can test that. Or it could be that, if I ask individuals that are engaged in the process, what it is that makes, if I ask teachers what it is that makes third grade students successful in math, will they be able to tell me explicit factors? That could be a prediction. Sometimes it's very specific, sometimes it might be generic. Now, if it's very specific, that's probably a quantitative, deductive approach. If it's more generic, more a guiding question, more a broad prediction, then it might be more of a qualitative or inductive approach. But either way, that prediction is going to lead to an experiment. Now, maybe the experiment involves, random sampling and, two groups, and one group gets some treatment and the other group doesn't. And we see, how well these fifth grade students do on math. One of them uses one methodology, the other doesn't use that methodology or whatever. Then we can construct an experiment that would allow us to answer that prediction as to whether it's accurate or not. Or it could be something like, I'm going to talk to those fifth grade teachers and see if they can come up with reasons or reasonable factors as to why, some students are more successful in fifth grade math as opposed to others. And that'll let me come up with a set of factors, and then I can begin to, kind of construct more concrete hypothesis or theory out of. Well, then I perform the experiment and I have observational data. It may be very specific data in terms of quantitative outcomes. It might be less specific data in terms of concepts that I get from a qualitative study, from the questions I've asked those teachers. And in either case, I'll carry that back to my original theory, and I'll either modify, support, or develop a more explicit theory. And so what makes something quantitative or qualitative is really, is this theory explicit enough that I can measure specific variables to make a reasonable case or a reasonable prediction that I can then test in a very specific way? Or is the question, generic enough and broad enough that I don't know all the details and I don't know how, specific definitions of factors and things like that. And so I need to find out what those might be so that I can construct a more specific theory. That would lead to a qualitative approach. But the process is the same. It's just whether the theory is specific, like a hypothesis statement, or whether it's less specific, like a guiding question. But it's a closed loop. It keeps circling. And in the social sciences, we're always replicating work that other people have done. And that's the nature of empirical process, is that we replicate what other researchers have begun or what they've done. We do it with different circumstances or more specific definitions, or a different population, different samples, different grade levels. Whatever we do, we build it upon what came before. And so we don't ask questions that don't have a basis around which to ask that question. We don't do research that doesn't have some theory behind it, whether it's very specific or whether it's very general. And this is what I used to refer to as the empirical process, but I was told by the philosophers in the troop that probably that doesn't qualify as a philosophical empirical process, but that's okay. I just call it the scientific process, or a scientific method. But it is an empirical process. Questions or thoughts before we step ahead slightly? Okay. Now, so to kind of tie this to the specific methodologies, the methodology that's related to what may be happening on a qualitative side or what may be happening on a quantitative side. I've got a little chart over on As You Learn that's called Methods Chart, and it really looks at the two research modes. So let me get back over here and share that out. And maybe blow that up ever so slightly. There we go. Well, it's somewhere in between those last two clicks. Okay. It always seems to be right in between the last two clicks. So I'll see if I can just slide it back and forth a little bit. All right. This chart looks at the two research modes. Now I'm calling them a mode here because if we define these things strictly in terms of the variables that we use, the data that we use, it's limiting. If we talk about quantitative methodology as being purely numerical, that may not be accurate, because sometimes we collect narrative data and then we categorize it certain ways. And so it's not necessarily purely quantitative. Or if we're talking about qualitative stuff and we say it's always a matter of numbers and numerical data. Well, no, it's not always. I mean, it's if we say qualitative is all about narrative data, about words and narrative data, it's not always. Sometimes it's about coding. Sometimes it's about categorizing stuff. Sometimes, so the idea that there's only certain types of data that you collect for quantitative and only certain types of data you collect for qualitative is not 100% accurate. It has some inaccuracy to it. And so I call them modes simply because it's more the logic process that you use as opposed to the data that you collect. Now, sure, most of the quantitative data is numeric data and most of the qualitative data is narrative data, but not all. On the quantitative side, we make some assumptions, just as we do on the qualitative side. But on the quantitative side, we say that social knowledge or social facts has an objective reality. In other words, there are truths. There are universal truths. And there are things that are just true. And it doesn't matter the setting, the social frame, whatever, they're just true. The Greeks called it early on, it was Socrates and Plato, they called it idealism. And by idealism, they meant that there were certain ideals that were, kind of like laws of nature. They were carved in the stone. And the reason that you acquired knowledge or acquired learning was to understand and discover those things. But they were the same for everybody. They were, they were the truth. They were, what it was, and that was the end of the discussion. When we're doing quantitative work, we're always worried about the methodology. We want to be precise. We want to make sure that we can measure things in a very precise manner. We can define things in a very precise manner, and we can, maintain the integrity of the data collection. And so it's all about methodology. It's all about, what can we do methodologically to make sure that we are, following the book, so to speak. The variables can be identified and relationships can be measured. In other words, we can know what the specific variables are, and we can hypothesize what the relationships might be, and we can measure those variables and that outcome, that relationship. We have ways of measuring it. Now, the other thing that happens on the quantitative side is that we have an outsider's point of view. We have an objective point of view. We're not, a researcher is not a part of that context. You're looking at it from the outside. You're not a part of the mix. You're doing something to subjects and measuring what happens. But you're doing it from the outside. You're in an objective mode. The Greeks call that an etic mode, an etic view, outsider's point of view. On the qualitative side, reality is constructed. So if quantitative reality is hard and fast, which is a very positivist viewpoint, or what the Greeks would call an ideal viewpoint, the qualitative mode is a very constructivist viewpoint, or certainly post-positivist at least, but primarily constructivist. In that reality is created out of the context of social structures. And there are no absolute truths. There's the truth that's constructed, in a particular setting or in a particular context. And the Greeks call that idealism, just as Plato was Socrates' student, and they both believed in this concept of idealism. Aristotle was Plato's student, and he believed in what was called realism. He created a concept of realism, which basically said nothing is true unless I can see it and measure it. I can touch it. I can, I can't believe in these ideals unless I have evidence and data, or at least evidence. And so he began sort of the whole notion of empiricism, that we have to learn things. We have to collect evidence and learn things. We can't just take, for granted what, the elders have told us is true. We have to test it. And in that case, the primacy is always the subject matter. It's not the methodology. We can be somewhat flexible in methodology. We can use lots of different methodologies. We don't have to zero in on one specific set of notions. What's important is understanding the subject matter, understanding the concepts that we're trying to get at, and having as deep of understanding of those as possible. The variables are complex, interwoven, difficult to measure. Sometimes we might even categorize them as fuzzy because they don't have sharp edges and they don't have clear boundaries, and it's interwoven, it's interrelated. And so the point of view we have to take as a researcher on the qualitative side is an insider's point of view. We have to be part of that whole, the German word Zeitgeist. We have to be a part of that whole construct. We can't look at it from the outside. We have to be on the inside. And we have to interact with people, and we have to offer some empathetic understanding of people's ideas, and we have to interact with them. On the qualitative side, and the Greek word for that insider's point of view is emic, E-M-I-C. But we have to, on the qualitative side, we have to understand that the important thing is the interactions with the individuals. And on the quantitative side, the important thing is the objectivity to the method, making sure we keep all the T's crossed and the I's dotted, and we make sure we have the integrity of the method. And so that takes two very different sorts of approaches based on those assumptions. Any questions or thoughts about the assumptions before we roll on to purpose? Okay. On the quantitative side, the general purpose of quantitative inquiry is what we call generalizability. You hear the dogs yapping across the street. Hopefully they're not too much of a problem. We live in My neighbor across the street has two little Yorkie puppies. Well, not puppies anymore. They're 4 or 5 years old. And they made the sound move of bringing two little male Yorkies home as puppies together. And so they instantly want to attack and bark at anything that moves and anybody that walks by. So, yeah. All right. Okay. I think they're quiet. The primary purpose of the quantitative side is generalizability, because we want to know, the methodology is that we have subjects. We have kind of a larger group of subjects that we may randomly divide or we may randomly select from a population, and those subjects represent the population. And if we truly pick them randomly, they do represent the population. That's hard to do, but if we can, we can. And if whatever we find out about those subjects, we can generalize to the larger population to the extent that we randomly drew them from the population. And so the whole point of quantitative inquiry, or the large point to a quantitative inquiry, is to be able to generalize back to a larger group, to a bigger population. Now, sometimes we'll do that through prediction, models that do prediction, because we generally have a couple of variables, at least a couple of variables in a quantitative study, and there'll be an independent variable and there'll be a dependent variable. And we'll want to measure, is there differences created by different levels of the independent variable that make change things different on the dependent variable. That can be in the basis of predictability if we measure within individual subjects. If we have 50 subjects, and for each one of those 50 subjects, we get their GRE score and their second year GPA in grad school. We can use their GRE score to predict GPA outcomes. Now, it's not causation, it's just prediction. Or if we truly are able to set an experimental model that has, a couple of groups, one experimental, one controlled, then, we may be able to think about, causal explanations, or at least infer causation. We can never really know, but we might be able to infer it and talk about cause and effect. That this particular model has the effect of students doing better in the 5th grade math, or 3rd grade math, or whatever level I said it was earlier. And so, even though we can never know causation, we can infer it if we're able to have a more experimental sort of model. If not, then maybe the best we can do quantitatively is a predictive model. Now, on the qualitative side, we're always trying to find the context of something. What is it that we can understand about a particular setting, or a particular interaction, or particular groups of people? And so we're always within a group we work with a smaller number of people. We call them participants on the qualitative side. On the quantitative side, we call them subjects. And if you think about the subtleness of that difference, subjects you do something to, participants you interact with. And we're always trying to figure out, what happened within that context, or what happens within this context, or what are the important things. Sometimes we're interested in interpretation. We want to figure out why a certain thing happened, or why people did something. And we always work from within to do that. And then sometimes we want to understand different perspectives. We want to know, why do different people feel differently about this? What is the difference in perspectives? And so that might be another approach. we won't get into this long list of approach stuff here because we've talked about a lot of it already. The only thing I will mention is that you see some terminologies on the qualitative side that may be different for you, like naturalistic. You want to collect data in the most natural setting for the participants. And so instead of having them come in and talk to you, you go talk to them in their most natural setting. You know, on the quantitative side, you want to control the setting because you don't want, you know, extraneous variables to get in the way, things you can't measure or things you're not measuring. But on the qualitative side, we try to do as naturalistic as possible. The other term is this notion of researcher as instrument. The major instrument in a qualitative study is the researcher themselves. They're the ones that do the interpretation of what they see and what it means. And so that becomes the major influence. On the quantitative side, we're using formalized instruments and we're kind of constricting the space as much as we can. Now, for the researcher's role, on the quantitative side, there's a certain level of detachment, impartiality, an objective portrayal of the information. The write-ups are very abstract language, very technical language. On the qualitative side, we're more partial, we're biased, we're personally involved with the participants. We're empathetic. We're going for an empathetic understanding of what's going on with them. And the write-ups are much more descriptive. In fact, a term we use in qualitative work a lot is rich descriptions. In quantitative, we're going for, you know, more technical, abstract language. In qualitative, we're going for rich descriptions. And so it's two entirely different approaches. Now, there obviously are some folks that feel more comfortable with one than the other. Let me stop the share for a second. In the social science, it's not unusual for a lot of people in the social sciences to be more drawn to the qualitative side of things because they want to have that empathetic understanding. They want to be, you know, a person that interacts with people on a personal level. Sometimes, you know, there are people that want to have more precision, and they are drawn to the quantitative side. My particular preparation, I was in a PhD program many moons ago in the late 70s and early 80s that was a mixed methodology program, one of the first ones around the country that kind of had that methodology, that approach at the University of Virginia. And so we were trained in both methodologies. And some people found that difficult to do. Some people found it difficult to, you know, to kind of exist in those two spaces. Others of us found it, you know, kind of a natural fit to be able to do that. But it's really not about one being the better or one being worse. It's what your comfort level is and your understanding that you're going to do one or the other or both based upon the question and the theory, you know, how precise the theory is as opposed to a more general theory guiding question type theory. And so that's what you do. You do, you know, you figure out what's the question that needs to be answered, how would you answer that question, and then that drives your methodology. And so you don't try to do a qualitative approach on something that's a very, you know, specific, finite, quantitative sort of question. And you don't try to do a quantitative approach on something that's a little bit nebulous, but still, you know, we're still trying to define the theory a little bit better. And so you fit the approach to the nature of the question. So yeah, there are some areas that if you're drawn to qualitative work that you won't be able to do. And just as there are some areas that if you're drawn to quantitative work, you won't do those areas either. Because it's just, I mean, you're limited in how you kind of approach those things. Now, there's an Achilles heel for both of them. There's an Achilles heel for both of them, and it's different. And so I apologize for the blah, 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 where's it at? Okay. I apologize for the link to this online textbook research methods. It used to be free, and it used to be not have advertising. And the guy who wrote it sold the textbook to the textbook companies about 10, 15 years ago. And the stipulation of him selling it to them, that they would allow him to maintain an open source free version of it online. And up until last year, he was able to do that. And then I think the textbook companies sort of ganged up on him and made him put ads on the online version. So I apologize for the messiness of it, but let's go over and pull that up because it's still the best explanation of this. There's what this particular author or this particular scholar calls the research fallacies. And he defines a fallacy as an error in reasoning, sometimes based on just bad assumptions. Okay. And for the quantitative approach, he calls the large fallacy, or the Achilles heel, so to speak. He calls it the ecological fallacy. And it occurs because when you're doing quantitative work, you do analysis around aggregate data. So you don't look at individuals, you look at the aggregate data of a group of individuals. And so when you arrive at a conclusion out of quantitative work, it's a conclusion based on aggregate data. Well, if you then try to take that data, that outcome, that conclusion, and apply it to individuals, that's an error in reasoning. It's a logical error, because what you know is you know about a group, you don't know about individuals, because within a group, individuals vary widely. And in North Carolina, the thing that comes to mind to people most in education is the EVOS system. And the EVOS system is built on a logical error. It's built on a logical assumption that we can know a lot about a group of thousands of students. And we can use what we know about a group of thousands of students to predict growth for individual students. And you just can't do it. It's a logical error, and it's called the ecological fallacy. Now, on the qualitative side, because in qualitative work, you're collecting individual data on individual participants, and not a lot of them. It might be 5 or 6, or maybe even less sometimes. And so you're collecting a lot of information on a very small number of people. And you have no way of knowing whether they represent any larger group. You don't know whether you're dealing with the average or the exception. And so if you then try to make statements about a group based on what you know about a few individuals, that's what the scholars call an exception fallacy. It's a hole in that logic too. And so you can't take, in a summary, you can't take what you know about groups and apply it to individuals. Vice versa, you can't take about what you know about individuals and think it applies to a group. And so those are the Achilles heels of the two, sort of methodologies or modes. And that, to me, that is the strength of a mixed methodology, because you kind of take into account both of those ideas. And you can use one to support the other or one to explain the other. Any thoughts or questions about that? Okay, I'm going to plow right on through here and get into talking about critiquing research articles and looking at research articles, because there's no sense taking a 10-minute break and then coming back and doing another half an hour this late in the evening. So we'll just kind of plow through. See if we can do this in 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can kind of all go on about our ways. And I don't know about you, but I got to be on the road tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. So I might need to sleep tonight. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Old guys can never be sure, but we'll give it a shot. The first piece after you've decided, or after you've settled on a research question, or in class case maybe an intervention or whatever we want to call it, the very next thing we do is we go out and look in the literature, look in the professional literature, to figure out how this fits in, how this idea fits in with what we already know. And so there is some natural logic to looking in the literature to see what we can gather from what other people have done, what other people have written. Now, I mentioned that a lot of the literature, there's some holes in it, there's some, flaws in it, and so you have to first make sure that they have all the things in them they should have in them, and then you kind of make a judgment as to whether they did a pretty good job with it or not. Here's a clue. Everybody that does scholarship, everybody that writes articles and does presentations and all, they all write well. Almost all of these pieces are well written. But being able to write well doesn't mean a hang about how well the research was done and whether it's meaningful research or not. So don't get caught up in how well people write. It's not a novel. It's not a anything like that. It's a reflection of the research and the data in the research, and so you're really interested to see whether they have the elements in there that you would like to see in a research article. So let me see if I can get that up. Okay. All right. Share. Okay. Once again, this is a little handout that's up on As You Learn. Tip number one, okay? Know the goals of educational research, or research in general. The goal of research is to observe phenomenon in whatever field you're looking at and attempt to explain why these phenomenon exist. In other words, you're looking for cause and effect, you're looking for relationships, you're looking for interaction, you're looking for all those things. That's why you do the research. And so that's the overall goal. Now, to foster that goal, there's a certain structure that most research articles, journal articles, presentations at conferences, thesis, traditional dissertations, there's sort of a model that they all follow that's consisting of these 7 sort of pieces: a title, an abstract, an introduction, lit review, a methodology section, a results section, and a discussion. Now, if you think about, say, a dissertation, it has all of these elements. but it also does it in 40 or 50,000 words. And a journal article or a paper for a conference can be anywhere from 4,000 or 5,000 words to, say, 12 to 15,000 words. And so obviously all these elements have to be in there, but they're somewhat compressed. Like a methodology section might be a short paragraph or a paragraph or two, as opposed to, 20 pages in a dissertation. But all the elements should still be there. Now, the title, it's important to understand what you hope is in a title. A title, you hope it indicates the independent and dependent variables, the cause and effect sort of variables, the type of people who were in the study, and some implication as to what impact you're looking for. Were you looking at causality, or were you looking at relationships, or were you looking at predictability? And so there should be some indication of what kind of relationship it's exploring. This title, for example, The Effects of Breakfast on High School Students' Achievement, has all of those elements. The independent variable is breakfast. The dependent variable is student achievement. The group is high school students. And the general causality you're looking at is basically, does breakfast improve achievement? And so this short little title has all those elements in it. And good research articles don't have huge titles. They tend to have, fairly concise titles. Now, the abstract, generally abstracts, depending on the editor and depending on the journal or the proceedings or whatever, abstracts are generally between, say, 50 and maybe 200 words at the most. And they're really succinct overviews of the research. And they have three basic elements, typically: the purpose of the study, the methodology used, and the major results. No discussion, nothing about rationale, nothing about why do we do this, that, or the other, but just those things: the purpose of the study, the research methodology used, and the results of the study. So if you look at the title and you look at the abstract, you should be able to figure out, is this something that I need to read or want to read for what I'm trying to do? You should not have to go any further. The introduction section establishes the research problem, establishes the importance of the study. Why is it important to do this? Defines the key terms, because as a researcher, you have to define those key terms that you want everybody to be on the same page with. So if you define achievement a certain way, you want everybody to see it that way. And then indicates the research question and or the hypothesis. Should be very explicit. It's either be a clear hypothesis statement, or it'll be a clear guiding research question. Questions with, could be more than one. Could be a major question and some sub-questions. But it should be very explicit. The lit review is to do three things: an overview of the relevant literature, how this current study will advance the field of knowledge, the knowledge in that field, and the rationale for conducting the study. Now, if it's a qualitative study, this rationale, it will be kind of called a theoretical perspective. And it might be based on a theory, it might be based on a particular researcher, a particular philosophy, but it's a theoretical perspective. If it's a quantitative study, it will be what's called a conceptual framework, in that it will refer to an explicit framework within the literature that kind of allows you to conduct this study with the conditions that you lay out. It's important to know whether the sampling was random or not. If it was random, then you can look for the authors to try to generalize results to a larger population. If it's non-random, then you should know that they have to avoid that. And so if the sampling is non-random, which most qualitative studies are, you can't really generalize. You have to have random samples to even begin to have the notion of generalizing. So if you find they don't have random samples and later on they try to bring the results back to a larger population, it's probably a logical error. Methodology is very concise, very precise. Smallest section of the article, smallest section of the dissertation, smallest section of the thesis. In an article, it might be no more than a couple of paragraphs, if that. The research design used, the way in which you're collecting data, how you're going to do that, under which conditions, and then describe how you're going to analyze the data. And this is generally the most concise, most precise section of the article. The results section summarizes the data collected, links the data to the research question or hypothesis, and describes what the researcher learned from the data. Once again, this is very specific. No conclusions, no implications, just here's the data we got. And then the discussion section will have summarized the purpose of the study, describe the methodological limitations, what couldn't you do, or what were limitations on what you tried to do. How does it fit in with the literature? Does it enhance the literature? Does it support the literature? Does it contradict the literature? What are specific implications for practice from the study? What could you suggest that you do different in practice, in practical situations, based on the study? And then what suggestions are there for further research? What are the unanswered questions? What's the next step? What's the, those sorts of things. And a good article will have almost all of that in there. Questions? Okay. So what are you going to do for the next almost 3 weeks? I did determine a set of meeting dates. That's on the As You Learn page in the first block. I'll run through them real quickly. It's tonight. Next meeting will be September 26th, which is 3 weeks from tonight. In October, we'll meet on the 10th and 24th. And then in November, we'll meet the first 3 weeks, 7th, 14th, and 21st. And obviously, there'll be big chunks of async stuff to be done in between. The next chunk, which is up on As You Learn already, and I'll provide more detail in a follow-up email when I send out the kind of feedback on your ideas, is to take this idea, refresh it, clean it up, take the feedback, see what, how you go with it, settle on at least one, not at least one, and then over the period of the next 3 weeks, begin to look for lit review sources. Now, there'll be 2 or 3 iterations of this lit review. So this is not designed to be, a polished, finished sort of notion at this point. If you want to do, annotated bibliography, or if you want to do, paragraphs of different articles and things like that. That's fine at this point. What you will want to do over the next couple of iterations after this, though, after I get this one and react to this one, is begin to construct a narrative that looks for connections and patterns and themes in the lit review. Now, we're only going to require 8 to 10 sources. If you get going on it and you discover, you know, a couple of extra things you want to put in or whatever, feel free. Never let me stop you. I'm just putting a floor of 8 to 10. You don't necessarily have to have 8 to 10 by the first iteration. You got 5 or 6 good sources going by the time you submit this next thing. That's great. But eventually we'll end up with 8 to 10. There'll be a kind of a narrative, a constructive narrative around the sources, around the lit review. There'll be some summation at the end of it, and there'll be implications for your particular research after the summation. But we don't need to get there quite yet. We just need to get in there, start digging out sources, and see what you can find. Don't forget to look at bibliographies. If you find one good article and you really like where it's going, and it kind of zeroes in on what you want to do, go through all the pieces that need to be there and make sure that they've done a pretty good job with all that and all that. But don't forget their bibliography, because that sometimes is a good roadmap to see maybe where you need to go and stuff. But you need that.
Do you anticipate it's being done before Thanksgiving, or are we meeting in December?
No, we're not meeting in December. I'm hoping that a finished draft will be ready, if not before Thanksgiving, right after Thanksgiving, but it won't require us to meet. And then, there's no reason to meet. But, the other part of this is that if we need to meet individually, reach out, let me know, and we'll set something up. We'll sit and do a Zoom session. Yeah, today it was one of those days I had 5 different Zoom sessions before I had class during the day. Now, 3 of them were the same doc student, but that's okay. He's got to be finished in a month and 2 weeks. So he's somewhat in a full-blown panic right now. So I have to keep stroking his ego and tell him, you'll get it done. You'll get this, you'll get this. But yeah, if we need to meet, just let me know and we'll pull it together. Look for your feedback. It's coming early next week, or maybe by the very first of the week. And from there, we'll kind of see how this lit review plays out. If you run into problems or whatever, I'm just give me a yell, and we'll kind of react to that. And the thing about the course, the Research 5000, I know it's a course we teach for School Admin, but I'm not being in that program, I'm not sure how they handle that crossover anymore. And so, call Barbara Howard or email Barbara Howard and ask her that question. Lay it out for her and ask her that question. She'll tell you. She's the person that's directing the admin program right now. Other questions, comments, thoughts? All right, folks, have a good evening. I will see you in 3 weeks. And if you need me, give me a yell. I'll do what I can. Have a good one.